Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Ayin Aleph. Today's daf is sponsored by Terry Kravosha and Rabbi Chaim Herring in loving memory of Terry's mother, Helene Kravosha, Hannah Mindel Bat Yerachmi Al Kohen and Fega Rabba on her first year at site. The true Eshet Chayil. We're going to get started. I think I didn't say that right. It should be Chana. Sorry. I wrote it in English. It came out as Hannah, but it should be Chana. Okay. We are going to get started with our Mishnah. Which is actually a very similar Mishnah to a Mishnah we already saw. And in fact, we actually quoted this Mishnah back when we quoted the previous. Okay, without more introduction, we're talking about the Mishnah that, if you remember, we had a whole machloka between Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis about whether when you sold a house and you kept back the bore, the pit, did you leave yourself an access route or not, which we then explained, even though it didn't say so in the Mishnah, that it must be that the machloka between them is, does a seller sell generously, or does a seller sell sparingly? And then we said, how do you know that's really what the Mishnah went? We had this long sugya where we said, well, maybe you can't learn it from the first part of the Mishnah, but the Mishnah actually had two different cases, where one is you sell your house, leave the bore for yourself, and the second was you sell the bore and leave the house for yourself. So maybe it said it in both to teach you that. And then it said, no, still you could say the machloket is not exactly based on that, and not necessarily in all cases. And then we jumped to this Mishnah and said, well, this Mishnah says the exact same thing. And then said, well, still, and then it said, oh, from the last part of this Mishnah, you can conclude. And in fact, by the time they quote the last part of this Mishnah, which is we're going to read in a minute, they finally conclude that it must be that the machloka between them is really mocher ba'ayin yafa or mocher ba'ayin ra'ah, and that's the basis of the machloka, Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis, and it's as broad as we kind of thought it was at the beginning. So that's where we met this Mishnah already, and now let's read it. Lo tabor velo tagat velo tashovach. Okay, it really starts mid-sentence. It's kind of a strange Mishnah, but again, when we cut these Mishnayot, because we're reading them in the Gemara, and the Gemara stopped the Mishnah there and quoted it there, if you read the Mishnayot as one continuum, it actually makes sense, because it's really a continuation of the previous Mishnah, which means you bought a field, and we had a whole discussion, what's included, what's not included. So they're just continuing in what is not included in the sale of the field. Lo et habor velo et hagat velo et hashavach. So now let's explain. When you sell a field, if there's a pit in the field, that's not included in the field. If there's a wine press or a dovecote, not included in the sale. Bein charevim, bein yeshuvim, whether they're not in use anymore or whether they're in use. It doesn't matter if they're being used, they're not being used. Tzarich likach lo derech. And here comes the repeat of what we saw in the previous sugya. And if you did this, sold the field, left for yourself all these items, which is the standard, well, you have to buy an access route according to Rabbi Akiva. The rabbis say, no, you don't. And as we said before, it's because Rabbi Akiva thinks that you sell generously and therefore you sold everything. And if you need an access route to get to your board, and you don't obviously sell everything, because things that aren't included in field will not be sold, but you don't get an access route automatically. You'd have to buy one. Chachamim say, no, you don't, because you sell sparingly. And again, one of the reasons we said you sell sparingly, and this is going to come up again later today, is because you were forced to sell. Why? What does it mean you're forced to sell? Well, you're desperate for money. So you're not going to sell. You're just going to sell what you have to sell, and not any farther than that. Umodet Rabbi Akiva, and this is going to be, again, the same as we saw in the previous time we had this in the Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva agrees, though, with the rabbis that Bisman she'amar lo chutz me'el, if you added words and said, I'm selling you my field, but not the wine press, but not the pit, whatever it might be, which you didn't need to add because it's anyway not included, you must have been saying, right, that you wanted to keep an access route, and therefore he agrees, in that case, she'enot tzarich likach lo derech. You don't need to buy an access route. Mecharan la'achir, and here's the second case in this, the same way we had a second case like this in the previous one, which is if I sold, though, to someone else, specifically not the field, but the wine press, the pit, the dovecote, then Rabbi Akiva Omer, Eino tzarich likach lo derech, then that person doesn't need to buy an access route, because same idea. Even though in the first part of the Mishnah, Rabbi Akiva says, I have to buy an access route if I sell you the field, but not the object I keep for myself, that's because I sell very generously. So in the reverse case, where I sold specifically the pit, then we assume I sold generously, so I sold you an access route, so you don't have to buy an access route to get to the pit that I sold you. But Chachamim omrim tzarich likach lo derech, and the rabbis, according to their approach, say, of course, you have to buy a path, because if I sold you the pit, I'm only selling you the pit. I'm going to sell very sparingly, and therefore you have to buy an access route. That's the first part of our Mishnah, which, like I said, is a repeat. One case was the case of the house. This is the case of the field. The whole thing we had to deal with last time was, which again, they're not going to deal with it at all here because we already dealt with it. It was on Daf Samach Daled. If you want to go back, this Mishnah was specifically quoted on the Amud Bet part of the it was the whole long diyun. It started on Samach Daled, Amud Aleph, moved to Samach Daled, Amud Bet. And then it was, well, why do you need to say both, right? We came up with one reason why you need to say both, but that was only sufficient to say why we needed case number one. It didn't explain why we need case number two. Case number two obviously came to say this machloket, mocher b'ayin yafa ma'a, applies across the board to include more cases. Now the Mishnah continues. We have a long Mishnah. Bamid dvarim amurim. Now we're forgetting about the access route issues. We're done with that. Now we're moving to the basic idea that if I sell a field, it doesn't include all the things both in the previous Mishnah and the things in our Mishnah. It's not going to, right? It will include the avanim that you need for the field and all that, blah, blah, blah. It's not going to include all those other things. And it's also not including the bor, the gat, the shavach. However, this is only true, and this line we also quoted before on Samachay, b'mochel. Remember we said this whole concept, and it a little bit has to do with the access route, because the access route is based on this concept of, if you're going to sell something, right, either we're going to say you sell sparingly or we say we're going to sell generously. Now that's all the machloket there, and whether these things are included in someone who sells. Also, it's really the access route issue, and it's also what's included in the sale. If I sell you a field, it doesn't include it. We're going to assume when I sell, even if we say I sold generously, still, I sold what I needed to sell. I was on suhu, right? I was stuck. I was desperate. Needed money. I sold, but I didn't sell any more than I needed to sell. But if I'm giving you a gift, we assume I give the gift generously. The Gemara is going to ask, what exactly is the difference and why is there a difference? But that's the basic premise, and we'll get to it more in the Gemara. Now we're going to talk about other cases and what's the story. Does a field, getting this field, would it include all these other things or not? So we're going to have a few different cases. So we started with sale. We moved to gift. Okay, gift giving is going to include everything. Ha'achim shachalku, two brothers dividing up an inheritance. Zachu b'sadeh, zachu b'kula. We're going to assume when it comes to inheritance, if you got the field, you got everything. Okay, now you could say, this is, we said before, that there's this concept, at least one opinion was that, just eluded me for a second. It was in my head a second ago and I just forgot it. Right. Tachat avotecha yubanecha. Remember? You want to live like the father lives. So the father had the field with the bor, with the gat, with everything in it. You get it as the father had. But you can also explain it according to the other opinion. And here some of the commentaries say something interesting, which you might accept, might not accept, depends on your relationship with your siblings, but that the brothers, when they divide things, they kind of want to be done with each other. If they don't want to be sharing this property in any way, they want to say, okay, you get your part, I get my part, and let's part ways. Okay, now, even if it doesn't really mean part ways, but in a business sense, they don't want to have to do with each other and have to be always going into the other's field to get. Nobody wants to be beholden to their sibling in any way. So that's possibly another reason. They say the nature of it. Some people just say simply, well, the assumption is if I'm getting one field, you're getting a field, or you're getting something in exchange. So that means that you're going to want your thing completely, and I'm going to want my thing completely. So I'm willing to give you everything in this one because I want everything in the other one. It's another way. And there's a lot of things today we're going to see. There's multiple interpretations, as usual, to how to understand why this is. The next case is you acquire an ownerless field. So generally the case they bring is a convert dies, has no heirs, so it becomes ownerless property. So you go and acquire the field. Now again, there's nobody on the other side here. It's just you. You came and acquired the field. It was ownerless. So in that case, you obviously get all of these items because there's no one saying, oh, that's mine, or keeping it for themselves. Or with any motivation to keep it for themselves, like the seller who sells is obviously keeping part for themselves because there was no reason they needed to sell the whole thing. And they didn't specify. They just said field. Field doesn't include all those items. That's not true when we're talking about no owner. Last case, and here there's going to be a machloket, which we'll only understand later in the Gemara, later today. What if I consecrate a field? Right? I say this is for the temple. Hikdishet kula. According to Tanakama, okay, makdish, kind of like someone who gives a gift. It's a generous, right? It's a donation. So when people donate, they donate generously. Rabbi Shimon disagrees. Rabbi Shimon omer makdishet hasadeh. It's a very strange language, but I'll explain what it means in a minute. Lo hikdish ela et hacharuv amurkav ve'et sadan shikma. Okay, the literal translation is, you translate it really literally, which is not the way to translate. Sounds like the only thing you were makdish in the field is the charuv and the shikma. That's not possible. What he means is, now remember, the charuv, the murkav, the grafted carob tree, and the sycamore tree that's grown properly, right, that's ready to be cut, those are in the list of things that generally aren't included, right? So what does he mean here? He means that if I sanctify a field, obviously everything that was on the very first list in the previous Mishnah, the stones that are required, that are needed for it, and blah, 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 all those things, the ungrafted tree, all that's obviously included, okay? Just like a sale. Everything that would be in a sale is included in the consecration. However, Rabbi Shimon says there's 2 items on the list of things not included in a sale that we will include here. So whereas the rabbis say everything is included, it's a complete, all-encompassing everything, the boar, the gat, the shavach, the trees, the blah, 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 everything. Comes Rabbi Shimon and said, no, not everything. It's actually very much like a sale, other than these 2 trees. Why these 2 trees would be also included, we're going to have to see in the Gemara. You can already start thinking about it, which is they're the only items that are trees. Everything else is something dug in the ground, something external. And what's with trees? Trees take nutrients from the ground. Okay, I'll already kind of tell you this so that when we get there, you'll know what we're talking about, which is that the trees take nutrients from the ground. So we can understand this in a few different ways, why this is. Okay, we're going to see it. I'll read you the line on Amud Bet. Tane Allah, there's a bright about this that says, Amar Rabbi Shimon, Matam. They're getting nutrients from a consecrated field. So let's think about it. Okay, now there's a few ways to understand this. The Rashbam says, well, this is what you call gidule hekdesh. It's something that grows from hekdesh because the tree is going to grow all the time. Where is it growing from? It's getting its nutrients from the ground. The ground is sanctified, so the tree is sanctified. By default, it's sanctified. So that's the Rashbam who understands this as it's completely sanctified. Some people think it's not actually sanctified. It's just that the Ritva says something interesting. The Ritva says it looks to people like it's sanctified since it gets nutrients from the ground. It doesn't actually become hekdesh, but it doesn't look right. It doesn't look right that you'll be benefiting from a tree in a field that's hekdesh. You can imagine it, right? It just seems weird. Why would you be benefiting? A pit, fine. Everyone knows that's distinct from it. But a tree, it doesn't look right. That's another way of understanding it. There's some other ways as well. I'll leave it at that. So again, debate about this one issue, about the hekdesh, and whether it makes the whole field, everything in it, including the pit and everything, or really nothing other than the basics, but yes, trees, because the trees that are generally not included because they're so significant, and obviously you didn't mean that because you want to keep it for yourself. Even, and the logic here is, even if I keep it for myself, it doesn't matter because it becomes automatically hekdesh, or it looks like hekdesh. Okay, so now we get to the Gemara. The Gemara starts off with a basic question: Maishna mecher or Maishna matana? Why is a gift different from a sale? To which Perish Rabbi Yehuda ben Nikosa, sorry, it's not Rabbi Yehuda, Yehuda ben Nikosa, Lifnei Rabbi. Yehuda ben Nikosa brought an explanation in front of Rabbi and said, Ze peresh v'ze lo peresh. Very strange interpretation. He said, the one who gave the gift said it all explicitly. I'm giving you this as well. And the one who sold it didn't say, which sounds like it's arbitrary, right? It could have been someone who sold would put everything in, and someone who gave a gift wouldn't say anything, and then it wouldn't be the distinction. It sounds like he's doing what we call an ukimta to the Mishnah. The Mishnah, when it says a sale includes everything, it's only if the person giving the gift specified everything. It's a little bit of a strange interpretation to which the Gemara said. What do you mean? That's not what the Mishnah says. Hi, ze perish, v'ze lo perish. What? The one who gave the gift specified and the other one didn't? Ze lo perish, v'ze lo perishu. The Mishnah clearly is a case where neither one specified. So that can't be. Ella, so they modify what he said, and they said what he must have meant is ze hayalo lefaresh v'ze lo hayalo lefaresh, which means this one should have specified, and this one didn't need to specify. Okay, who's this one? Who's that one? And what does this mean? So the Rashbam says ze hayalo lefaresh means noten matana, the one who gave the gift. I'm reading in the Rashbam now in Dibur Matchiz hayalo lefaresh. And I want to read the Rashbam. He has two interpretations, and I think it's just interesting to read. Since normally, they assume, everyone knows that the gift is given very generously. So if I wanted to give a gift of a field and I wanted to keep the pit for myself, I needed to have said something about it. That's what it means, zehayalo lefaresh. If I didn't want to include them, like the default is everything's included. So if I didn't want to include it, I needed to have written something about it. And therefore, if I didn't, it's not. But mocher, and as we've said this already many times, zuze ansuhu. I'm skipping a few words and then whatever, but mocher, zuze ansuhu, meaning the money was pressuring him. And he had no choice but to sell, and therefore we assume, right, he didn't need to specify that he wasn't including everything. We always assume a seller is going to be selling only what they need to sell and not any more than that. So that's the first interpretation. So what I want to point out about the first interpretation is who needed to specify in this? The one giving it, the seller or the giver of the gift, the original owner. Now, if you skip a line, Rabbeinu Hananel, I'm back in the Rashbam, Rabbeinu Hananel Peresh, but he says that Rabbeinu Hananel said the person who needed to specify and didn't need to specify is not the person giving it, but the person purchasing or receiving it, the recipient. Hakoneh hayalo lefaresh. Dekeva, now, who hayalo lefaresh, which one should have specified in this case? The buyer should have specified if, now it's the reverse. It's both the reverse of who and which one, not the gift one, but the sale. In this case, the person purchasing it should have specified if I was buying something and it was including more than the standard, well, it's my responsibility to make sure it says so inside. Now here we're going to come up with a totally different reason why he's different from the gift recipient. Because if I'm buying something, I'm not embarrassed to ask you to write it down. In fact, we had a whole thing the other day. It makes the shtar better, and you should insist. It's important to insist when you're buying something that everything's in writing. So if I wanted to, so now the assumption of this answer is the standard in any case is that a field is a field and not the pit or anything else. But what's the issue? If I'm buying it, so the standard is the field, not the boar. If it was the boar, I, as the buyer, should insist that it's written in there that I bought the boar. And if I didn't, well, then that's my fault. And we assume then it must be not, because if really it includes something extra, I would have insisted. However, imagine you're getting a gift. Someone's giving you a gift of a field. You're embarrassed to go say, can you just write down that it includes the boar also? Right? You're not going to ask them to do that. That would be humiliating. It's just not appropriate. So because of that, therefore we assume, now assume what? He says it very nicely, specifically ala noten ramya legaluye. If really the person giving the gift plans to give you something additional, then they should have put, right? They should have said it. And if they didn't say anything then kanahako. So actually, it's not what I said before. The still hayalo lefaresh is still actually the one giving the gift, but for a totally different reason, because what's the expectation of who would ask and who wouldn't ask, okay? So because the recipient would never ask, if actually, right, we're going to assume that if they weren't including it, they would have written, right? In lo peresh, that if they really weren't giving it, it's actually not what I said. Let me just clarify. If they weren't giving it, then they should have said, okay? Therefore, lo peresh kanahakol. If you were giving a gift, since the person who's receiving it would never have the audacity to ask you to put it in. Therefore, we assume you're giving everything. And if not, the responsibility is on you to write, it doesn't include this and that. Okay, so anyway, those are two different interpretations, but that explains to you why there's a difference between them both. Now we have a case of someone who gave a gift, and we're going to see how far do we take this idea that a gift giver gives generously. And it's a totally different situation, but an issue, and we're going to have a debate between Zutra and Rav Ashi about how to rule here. And it was an actual case. Sahuda Amrlahu, there was a person, we're going to assume, the commentaries assume, on his deathbed, who said, the reason they assume this was a shliv meira is because it was just his words alone. Usually that doesn't work, but on someone on their deathbed, we take their words very seriously, so we don't want them to be worked up when they're on their deathbed, and therefore we do it. We act on what they said. And also he's not around to clarify exactly, right? The person now is dead, and we have to figure out what to do. So he said, give so-and-so a house which can hold 100 barrels of wine. Either it's holding 100 barrels of wine or potentially can hold, meaning it's a house that has, let's just go with, it's a house that has space to hold 100 barrels of wine. Now, when the person died, they went to the house and they saw it was bigger than what the person said. It could actually hold 120 barrels. Okay, instead of being, X by X, it was X plus 10 by X plus 10, whatever. It was bigger size. So the question is, what does the person get? Amar Zutra, mea amarle, mea veslin lo amarle. Zutra says, the guy said, a place that could hold 100 barrels, not 120 barrels. So this house can hold 120 barrels. Let's divide the house. The percentage that holds, the part that holds 100 barrels, we'll give to the person. The other 20, space that could hold 20 barrels, is divided by the heirs. Rav Ashi Amar, Milo Tznam, but doesn't it say in our Mishnah, Bamid Varim Amurim b'mochel? Remember, our Mishnah said that's only for a seller that we're going to view things in a very narrow manner. But if someone gives a gift, they're very generous. Alma mandiyav matana ba'ayin yafayayiv. So obviously, when someone gives a gift, they give very generously. Hachanami. So therefore, in our case, it's a person who's giving a gift. Mandiyav matana ba'ayin yafayayiv, and we're going to assume that when they said a house of 100 and they have a house that's bigger than that, we're going to assume that he meant bigger. Probably just wasn't sure exactly how many barrels it would hold. And we're going to interpret it as, he probably meant 120. By the way, they say if it was, let's say, double the size, then no. Okay. But because this is within the realm of which someone could potentially get confused, right? This is, by the way, the same 1/6 because, right, 20 out of 120 is 1/6. So remember, we always do it from the outside, not from the inside. So this is that same 1/6 that we talk about in sales and all that. If it's within a range that we just assume, and we're just going to interpret it generously, and the person gets the entire house. So we have a debate about whether the gift was complete or not complete, how we deal with it. Okay, now we're going to get to the more complicated part of today's daf. It's not so complicated. I'll make sure it's clear. But from here till the end of the daf, we're going to be in one sugya and even into tomorrow's daf. That's not really the main part of the sugya, or in other words, we're going to start with something else, and then we're going to bring in this machloket, and particularly Rabbi Shimon's opinion, in the context of this discussion. So we'll leave aside our Mishnah for right now, and we'll read Rav Huna, and then we'll get back to Rabbi Shimon. We'll see how it connects. Amar Rav Huna, and this is a different case. Ava gabda Amar Rabbanan. It's something we learned already, I think, right? Maybe not. Actually, it comes up on Pei Aleph, but I'm sure we saw this somewhere. Let me just see other references. Okay, we'll see. If you buy 2 trees, there's this distinction between someone who buys 1 or 2 trees and someone who buys 3 trees. If I buy 1 or 2 trees in your field, I don't get the land underneath it. It's not mine. I only get the tree. That's it. If I already buy 3 trees, I get the surrounding land. Okay, that's a rule. 3 includes the land, 1 or 2 doesn't include the land. So Rav Huna starts off with this afagav. Even though the rabbis say that if I buy up to 2, right? 1 or 2, it says 2 here, but it means 1 or 2, I don't acquire the land. However, and this is going to relate a little more to our Mishnah, Machar karka v'shiyer shnei lanot. But if it's the reverse case, where I sold you my field, but I said I'm keeping 2 trees for myself, in this case, yesh lo karka. I get to keep the land. Now, our big issue is going to be, is this just according to the one who says, to the rabbis who say, mocher ba'ayin ra'a mocher, and therefore if I'm selling you, right, if I'm selling you my whole property, but keeping 2 trees, I'm going to sell in a sparing way, and I'm going to obviously keep myself land? Or is this even according to Rabbi Akiva, who holds mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher? This might be an exception to the rule. Now, why will this be an exception to the rule? We're going to see. And the Gemara right now, and this is the issue that's going to be rejected later, but the Gemara right now says, "Va'afilu leRabbi Akiva, da'amar mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher." Even according to Rabbi Akiva, who thinks when I sell things, I sell them generously, which means if I sell my land and keep the trees, we would assume it doesn't include the land because I said I'm keeping trees, just trees. We're going to keep it as narrow as possible. But that's Hanemile when Rabbi Akiva said it. In what case did he say it? Gabe bor v'dut. He said it by a pit, a cistern. Why? What's the difference between that and the trees? Dilo kamak sheba'ara. It doesn't weaken the ground in any way. They don't gain nutrients from the ground. They don't affect the ground. So I'll sell you a field. I'll keep the bore for myself. And it's like I have a bore and you have a field and we don't have anything to do with each other, and I basically sell to you generously. So if I want to get a path there, I have to buy it myself. Aval ila, no, but trees are a totally different story. They weaken the ground. Now, let's go back to what we said about the brothers, right? You don't want to have anything to do with your brother anymore. You keep this, I keep that. Now, when I sell you land and I keep the trees, if my trees that I kept are taking nutrients out of your land, this is going to cause future stress between us and tension. In ita de lo shiur, if I didn't leave the land to myself that surrounds the trees where my trees are getting nutrients from, lemale, you could potentially down the road say, listen, this land is mine and it's weakening, your trees are weakening my land. Akor ilan chashkol vazil. Uproot your tree, take it and go somewhere else. You kept the tree, fine, keep the tree. It doesn't need to be ruining my land. Now, there's an interesting debate between the commentaries here. Do you really have the rights to do that? Because in the end, I didn't keep my tree to say I'm keeping my tree and that you could come uproot it. Some people think that really by law, you could actually say that. If it was ruining your land and weakening your land, theoretically, you could say that. And this is a legitimate claim, and that's why we're worried about it. Some people say it's not really a legitimate claim, but we're worried that you might say it anyway. In other words, just because it's not a legitimate claim doesn't mean, right? Oftentimes people say things like threaten people with empty threats, right? But I moved into an apartment years ago, got a 3-year option on a lease, and right after that, the mother who owned the property died. The 2 sisters wanted to sell it right away, and they wanted to kick us out of the, and they threatened us to no end about, you're out of here. And we kept saying, but you have no rights to do this. But it didn't stop them from trying to do it, right? So often that could happen where somebody, says, I'm going to do, threatens. With this, so the way I want to understand, the way I understand this is what it's basically saying is, if you keep the land around my trees, then it's just going to cause strife between us. Whether it's fair or not fair, it doesn't matter. It's just going to keep us interconnected. And therefore, there's no way, even according to Rabbi Akiva, who thinks that when I sell everything or generously, wouldn't say it here, because the assumption is that I'm not going to get myself into a scenario where we're going to be fighting all the time and where we're going to be interconnected. And therefore, that's why even Rabbi Akiva will agree with Rav Huna. That's what the Gemara thinks right now. Problem is, we're going to have an issue with it, which is our Mishnah. Tanan. Our Mishnah says, Rabbi Shimon omer, hamakdish et hasadeh lo hikdish ela charuv hamukav v'sadan hashikma. By the way, we're on Amud Bet if I didn't say so, and you'll see Amud Bet is very short, only 8 lines. So Rabbi Shimon says, Makdish et hasadeh lo hikdish ela charuv hashikma, charuv hamukav v'sadan hashikma, which remember what that means. I'll remind you. Rabbi Shimon says, when you consecrate a field, you consecrate just the field and just the things that normally go with the field, And in addition, right, not the board, not the got, all those things, but yes, specifically the two trees. And why? Tane Allah is right on that explains, which I already read to you before. Amar Rabbi Shimon matam ho'il v'yonkin misteh hekdesh. The reason is because what happened? You consecrated the field. Let's say you didn't mean to consecrate these trees, but what's the problem? The trees automatically become consecrated. Again, we gave different interpretations, either because they're gaining nutrients from the ground, which turns them into hekdesh. So even if I didn't want to consecrate them, they become consecrated because they've got nutrients of hekdesh in them, which makes them consecrated. Or like we said, the Ritva says not really, but it looks like you're eating hekdesh as opposed to a pit, which isn't gaining anything from the ground, so it doesn't look like it. Okay, but either which way we look at it, it has to do with the fact that they're getting nutrients from the ground. Now let's connect the dots. Now, if we say, I sanctified, I consecrated my field, but not my trees. But yet, because my trees are gaining nutrients from the ground, they now become consecrated. But that doesn't make any sense because what did we just say? If we say shiur, if we say that what Rav Huna said is true according to Rabbi Akiva and according to the rabbis, that when I keep two trees to myself, I keep the land underneath them. Then when I consecrate my field and intend not to include my carob or sycamore tree, then I'm keeping the land to myself. And then actually the land is not consecrated. So it doesn't match up. So the only way when it's gaining nutrients, it's gaining nutrients from what belongs to me, not consecrated land, because I didn't consecrate that. So Rabbi Shimon doesn't make sense in light of that. So how can we explain it? The only way to explain it is the following. Rabbi Shimon de'amar Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Shimon thinks that the land is not mine. The land is consecrated. Why? Because Rabbi Shimon holds mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher, like Rabbi Akiva, and that means that when I consecrate land, all the land becomes consecrated, and I don't keep the land under the two trees for myself. And Rav Huna, who had this other halacha, this is what he means. No, if I keep two trees, and I'm going to review Rabbi Akiva because I see from the question in the chat that wasn't fully missed a point, so at least some people. So I'll review. Rav Huna says, when you buy two trees, you don't get the land underneath. But if I sell you my land and keep the two trees for myself, there's no way I would be giving you the land underneath. I'm obviously keeping the land to myself because otherwise I'm going to end up with a future stress between us. So in the normal case of me selling trees, I'm selling you just the trees, you don't get the land. But if I'm keeping trees for myself, selling property, there's no way I would sell you property in a way that's going to cause me a problem down the road. Now, we thought he was saying that even according to Rabbi Akiva, because even Rabbi Akiva would agree with this. But can't be, because otherwise Rabbi Shimon makes sense according to nobody. Okay, because Rabbi Shimon is basically the premise of Rabbi Shimon is that I can consecrate land, keep trees to myself, but since they're yonik from the ground, since they're getting nutrients from the ground, the trees are consecrated, which means I can't actually keep the trees to myself. But even if I wanted to keep the trees to myself, I couldn't. Now, according to Rav Huna, I could, because I would obviously keep the land where it's getting nutrients for myself. Otherwise, they would become consecrated, like Rabbi Shimon says. So that means we have to say that Rabbi Shimon and Rav Huna hold by different people, and that it's all based on this machloket, Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis. Do I sell generously? Do I consecrate generously? Which, according to Rabbi Shimon, I do. That's why the land is consecrated. That's why the trees will become consecrated. According to Rav Huna, you'd say, no, I would keep the land to myself, but that's only if you hold like the rabbis. So while we thought that Rav Huna was according to everybody, because you could say to me, go uproot your tree, and therefore I'm obviously going to leave it to myself according to all opinions, it can't be true. Because otherwise, Rabbi Shimon has nobody to hold like. To which the Gemara has one small question and answer, which we'll resolve today, and then we're going to have other issues tomorrow. But the Gemara says, and we'll finish with this one last issue, which is, Ki Rabbanan Pshita, but wait. If Rav Huna holds like the rabbis exclusively and not like Rabbi Akiva, well, according to the rabbis, mocher ba'ayin Ra'a mocher, right? So Rav Huna doesn't need to tell us this. It's obvious. If mocher ba'ayin ra'a mocher, right, you're going to be sell sparingly. If I sold my field, kept 2 trees to myself, obviously I'm going to keep the land to myself. I don't need Rav Huna to tell me that. It's obvious from the rabbis. But remember, the rabbis are Tanaim. Rav Huna comes many generations later. He doesn't need to tell us this if it's obvious. To which they answer, no. There's one thing he wanted us to know. Nafkamina, there's a relevance to what? Inafle hadar shatilu. What he's telling us is this. If I sell you my land and I keep the trees to myself, so we already know it's obvious I'm going to keep the land as well. But if you go by the rabbis, you might have thought that, what does that mean? I keep the trees and the land for the use of the trees so that they get nutrients from it. But if those trees were to fall down or dry up and they're not usable anymore, useless, there's nothing there. If that were to happen, I'd be done with it. Because in the end, it's your field, right? It's in the middle of your field. And what I bought was the rights to the trees. The trees are no longer here. I'm done. Even though I gained the land underneath, but I only gained the land because I needed it for the nutrients. Comes Rav Huna and adds, no, if I keep 2 trees to myself, I'm keeping future rights. This goes back to some other sugya we saw about future building rights. What I'm keeping is, because he's adding something, we're basically saying, I'm keeping future building rights to basically be able to plant a new tree if that happens. I'm keeping the land. Really, the land is mine. It's not just part of your field and they're here so I can get nutrients for my trees. No, if those trees die, I can plant new trees in their stead. And that's what he's adding that you wouldn't have necessarily derived from the rabbis if you just had the rabbi's opinion. You might have thought that that's only as long as the trees are still there. Okay, so what did we do today? We started with a Mishnah that was very parallel to a different Mishnah about if you have a field, which we continued with the previous Mishnah about what parts aren't included. And then we had a parallel to an earlier Mishnah about, do you get a path to get to your pit and all those things that weren't included in the sale? Machloka Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis. Then we discussed what about other scenarios like brothers who divide up, gifts that are given, ownerless property that you're acquiring, and consecration. How are those laws similar or different to a sale? And we had a machloket specifically about the case of the Makdish, which came up in the sugya later. We'll get back to that in a second. Then we said, okay, the Gemara wanted to know, why is there a difference between a sale and a gift? And then we had a ramification, like a case where someone quoted our Mishnah and this distinction between a gift and a sale in a case that actually happened. And there was this machloket about the cows with the 100 barrels and how to rule on it. And Zutra ruled one way, but Rav Ashi, based on our Mishnah, ruled differently. Then we brought up this whole sugya about the Makdish. So I'll just quickly review the sugya. We had a statement of Rav Huna, basically about someone, even though normally 2 trees, you don't acquire land underneath, specifically, if you hold back 2 trees from property you're selling, you will get the land underneath. We thought that he was talking even according to the rabbi, even according to Rabbi Akiva, who thinks generally you do sell generously. In this case, you wouldn't, and you would keep it for yourself so you don't end up with future problems with your neighbor. And they might actually try to get rid of your tree entirely. But in the end, based on Rabbi Shimon and the way we explained Rabbi Shimon, that all has to do with nutrients from the ground, which then made this very similar. And then Rabbi Shimon doesn't seem, right, is saying something very different. Then we would, right, you can't put Rabbi Shimon and Rav Huna together. So the only way to resolve it is to say Rabbi Shimon holds like Rabbi Akiva, Rav Huna holds like the rabbis, and then Rav Huna doesn't fit in with Rabbi Akiva. And then we just have one other question, which is, well, if the rabbis, if Rav Huna goes with the rabbis, it's just obvious what he's saying. There's no chiddush here. And then they say, oh, no, there is. Okay. And then we said it's for future building rights, and that you wouldn't necessarily know by just knowing mocher ba'ayin ra'a mocher. You might have thought that's only as long as the trees are standing. That's a quick summary of today's daf, and we'll continue with the sugya in tomorrow's daf. Wishing everyone a good day and a chodesh tov.